recommend replacing a 2001 Audi S4 rear wheel bearing. First, use a flathead screwdriver or the Audi removal tool to remove the lug cap. This will reveal the axle bolt and the 5 lug bolts. Before you lift the car, break the axle bolt loose using a breaker bar and a 14mm hex bit socket. Insert your lug key and then using a breaker bar and a 17mm socket, break the lugs free as well. Use a jack or a lift to lift the wheel off the ground, and then using the 17mm socket, remove the 5 lug bolts. Go into the vehicle and make sure the emergency brake is off. What I am showing you now is the top caliper bolt. These require a 15mm open-end wrench to hold the support nut while removing the 13mm caliper bolt. When both of the bolts are removed, remove the caliper from the rotor. This may require some help from a rubber mallet. Remove the brake pads and set aside. Using an 8mm hex bit socket, remove the caliper bracket bolt. There will be an upper and lower bolt to remove. Remove the caliper bracket and the rotor and set them aside. Use a 10mm socket or open-end wrench to remove the 3 splash guard bolts. Then remove the splash guard and set that aside. At this point, a lot of tutorials say to remove the ABS sensor bolt and then remove the sensor. In my experience, this is nearly impossible without ruining the sensor, and this sensor is about $125, so it is much safer to unplug the sensor from the wiring harness located under the rear seat. Make sure you have clean hands and then pull up on the rear seat to pop it out of place. Then remove the rear seat. You can now see the wire coming from the ABS sensor through a grommet in the bottom of the car, then through another grommet under the back seat. Unplug the connector, remove the grommet, and then feed the sensor wire into the hole. Now, remove the wire from the bracket on the underside of the car, and then using a trim removal tool or a screwdriver, remove the grommet on the underside of the car, and then pull the unplugged ABS sensor through the hole. Remove the 2 plastic fasteners holding this bracket on, and then remove the bracket. Now we can start disassembling the upright. Use a 19mm wrench to remove the nut on this control arm. Don't bother trying to get the bolt off because there is no need. Use 2 17mm wrenches to remove the bolt from this suspension link. Now use 2 19mm wrenches to remove the bolt from the top control arm. Before removing the camber alignment bolt and the entire upright, note how the brake lines run around this control arm. Use 2 19mm wrenches to remove the camber alignment nut and then remove the bolt. I had to use a rubber mallet to break the bolt and washer loose. Make sure if you do hit the end of the bolt with a mallet, you thread the nut back onto the bolt until the nut is flush with the end of the bolt. This is to avoid mushrooming the end of the bolt. Using the 14mm hex bit socket, remove the axle bolt from the axle. Then remove the hub from the axle, and then remove the whole upright. Now it is time to press out the bearing and press in the new bearing. Unfortunately, I was only able to film parts of this process, so I will do my best to explain it. First, I supported the upright with the bearing face down. Supporting the upright while leaving clearance to press the hub out is kind of a trick. Use a die tool or a socket with a diameter just smaller than the inner bearing race and then press out the hub. When the hub breaks loose and falls out, the inner race will remain on the hub. This will have to be removed later. Now find a socket or die tool that has a diameter just smaller than the outer bearing diameter. Because it will take the most force to break the bearing free, support the upright with the bearing face down on a solid plate. Press on the socket or the die tool until the bearing has broken free. When the bearing does break free, support the upright around the edges so the bearing will be free to be pressed out the bottom. When the bearing has been removed, the upright will look something like this. Notice the back lip that the bearing was pressed up to. This lip is a 1/4 inch deeper than the bearing width. To remove the inner race from the hub, I used the bench grinder to notch the old bearing. I accidentally notched the hub as well. Try not to do this. I then used a chisel and a hammer to rotate the bearing and break it loose from the hub. This then allowed me to get the chisel behind the race and remove it from the hub. Note how the hub has a step in it. The larger diameter is toward the outside of the upright, so make sure you put the new bearing in with the larger diameter facing out. Clean the upright bearing housing to allow the bearing to be pressed in easier. Using a plate, press the new bearing in until the plate hits the upright. Then use the old bearing to push the new bearing in the extra 1/4 inch to the retaining lip. You can see I ground down the old bearing so it wouldn't get stuck in the upright. With the back of the new bearing supported, press the hub into the bearing. It is extremely important that the whole backside of this bearing is supported while doing this. If it is not, the inner race of the bearing will blow out the back, kind of like it did when you pressed the hub out initially. Now that the upright assembly is fully assembled, reinstall the upright following the uninstall procedures in reverse order. The ABS sensor wire can be tricky to feed back into the back seat. I used an unbent coat hanger with a hook on the end to pull the sensor into the back seat. The torque specifications for the axle bolt on this vehicle require the bolt to be plastically deformed every time it is installed. For this reason, a new bolt is necessary for each install. The torque specs for the axle bolt are 85 foot-pounds plus 1/2 extra turn to elongate the threads. Thank you for watching this episode of DIY Garage. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. If you'd like to watch more videos like this, you can visit mattsdiygarage.com. Please like and subscribe.